Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. After the addition of the Challenger 3 to the game, there has been a question which has been going around in my head over and over and over again, and it's a pretty simple one. When will Gaijin run out of vehicles? Now, the interesting thing about this is the way that it's been discussed in the past is the idea that they will literally run out of vehicles to add because there is obviously a finite amount of them. The problem with this idea is they could just keep adding very similar machines over and over again, specifically for different nations. If you have a look at nations such as Nigeria, for example, or Korea's, or even, others that are around the place, they could just keep copy-pasting their way through with a few little unique vehicles here and there to try and bolster the lineups. For example, something like even the tribal class destroyers, the second set of tribal classes, by the way, since there was some earlier 1900s tribal classes, but the ones which were started in 1936 and were commissioned between the 1930s and the 60s, there was 27 of them completed. So technically, you could have 27 of them in a tech tree, and they would all basically be the same. And they would all have maybe slight differences to them, but that kind of shows how many vehicles you could add even to one specific class, especially when it comes to naval stuff. So even though we have more than 2,000 vehicles in the game, they could easily put 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, and it wouldn't be too much of an issue. And the simple fact is, at this point in War Thunder's history, them adding hundreds of vehicles a year, or even around 100, or a bit more, isn't too surprising with the rampant expansion that they've been doing. So we have this situation where you have all of these other vehicles they could add, which would mean that they would never run out of vehicles, and this would never be a problem, but that isn't the issue. The issue is not whether they're going to run out of vehicles. It never has been, because they could go on for 50 years at the rate that they're at and still keep adding vehicles. The issue has always been and always will be people being interested in said vehicles. You could have a whole update called Update Tribal, as I said before, and just add 25 tribal classes. You could easily do that on top of the ones that we already have. But would people be interested in it? The answer is no. Basically, you would have a very small percentage of people who are interested, and then everybody else would just be like, well, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. So what ends up happening is you could easily add just tons of different modifications of the same vehicle. We've seen it over and over again, whether it's the Centurion variants, the SDRV 104s, or even just the shot CALs, which are in the Israeli tree. You have several sets of Centurions, all which pretty much play the same above the Mark III standard, and they're all over the place in different tech trees. Now imagine in a few years, how is that going to be expanded upon, and how is that going to be in the next stage of things? And after last year, where they did a bunch of research changes, specifically when it came to grouped vehicles, and also the amount of SL that you make, and some RP around the place, for me, I feel like that's the area that's going to be expanded a lot, with adding different variants, or even just pretty much the same variants as a lot of these vehicles, to bolster lineups as you go through. And that is going to be the key thing. How do you keep people interested in a game when the vast majority of the content has already been added, which can? And the way that you do it is pretty simple. You have 2 or 3 or 4 vehicles every update to kind of shine a light on and look at, and then all of the rest of them you add alongside of it. Maybe you have one kind of unique or iconic vehicle, like something like the Stug 4, for example, which still isn't in the game after so many years, or you have stuff like the B-26, like they've done in the past, and then you have that, so people are happy from the historic point of view, and then you have the large bangers, the high tiers, which people are grinding to, while also slotting in a few here and there, which might not be too different, such as 5 M109s over and over again, but they add something to the game to have a bit of fun with. And that seems to be the way that they're going. That seems to be something that has been focused on specifically over the last 2 or 3 years. But the question is it sustainable? When do you get to a point where you run out of those high-tier bangers? In ground, we are nearly there. There really isn't a lot of vehicles to actually add, which would give a bunch of different stuff. We have a few Abrams, right? Maybe one or two of kind of the modern era, and then they're going to go to more demonstrator prototype variants, which there are a few, but only maybe 5. So if you wanted to add one of those each update, that's a year and a half. The Leopard 2s, I mean, there's a million Leopard 2s, but if you actually want to add ones which are better than the standard that we have, you're looking at maybe 2 or 3, and once again, their changes are not too much. Same with the Swedish. I think there's one SGRV 122 left. For the Russians, you have, obviously, the leak of the T-80 BVM 2023, but that's really about it. Then you got the Armata, the Black Eagle, all that stuff, which could come around. And then for, let's say, Britain, well, we're already in kind of fantasy land in a way. There isn't really anything else they can add. And Japan, I mean, Japan's been maxed out for a long time. So you have these situations in ground where you basically already have this problem. And how do you deal with it? How do you keep people interested in grinding the high echelon stuff? And the way that they've tried to do it is through mechanics. But the problem with doing that is you give the highest echelon vehicles access to even more mechanics, making them even more broken, which is why I'm kind of worried about when they talked about modifying FCSs and making them a bit more realistic. That really worries me going forward, especially if they add more automatic systems to the game. But the question is, what do you do? What do you do after you've already added them all? They basically have now. So over this next year, it will actually be kind of interesting to see what they decide to do. And tracking specific patterns on what they add in each update, I think is super important to kind of get an idea of where the mindset is. We know that Gaijin plans stuff out well in advance, whether it's just standard ideas or whether it is meticulous ones like goals that they want to hit. That's why stuff like the roadmap was really nice to see, because it gave people a first look into how these things kind of work. But the question that I have is, looking at the trends of the last few years, what happens after that 2 or 3 years when you start running out of these vehicles? In ground, you're nearly already there. In aviation, if they go at the rate that they're going, then you basically have about 2 or 3 years before you get to stuff like the F-22, before you get to stuff like the big old SUs at the high echelons, and there's not really a lot else to go on. In Naval, as we said, they have a ton of expansion. Helicopters, not so much. They're pretty much out, and apart from adding some mid-tier stuff. But overall, it's just a really fascinating idea. So when it comes to these conversations, I'm really not bothered about if they can keep adding vehicles. Of course they can. And the main thing is interest. Are you interested in playing 50 Centurions? Are you interested in playing 50 M48s? Are you interested in playing 50 M60s? Can you, as an individual, go through the same type of vehicle over and over and over and over again with basically just nothing really changing apart from maybe a slight visual difference or maybe a slight mechanical difference between them? For me, I've been doing it for years, and I have found certain areas monotonous. When the Israeli tech tree came out, it was very tough to get through it, mainly because of the cruise skill stuff, and also because, once again, it was just a lot of vehicles that I played previously, which wasn't really fun. So I'm hoping that in the future, that is something that's focused on. Not the simple fact that just adding more stuff is good. Now, let's have a look at trying to add stuff which is slightly more unique, gives a slightly different playstyle, and also is easier to grind, if it is similar to what we've seen before. And that doesn't just mean grouped vehicles, that means others. And hopefully we can see expansions of nations. Hopefully we can see, more flags and more subtech trees and all of these different things. And hopefully they can keep going with some of the unique ideas as we go along. Otherwise, it's going to get monotonous. And I feel for some people, it kind of already has. We'll see what they do when it comes to that research setup, where they said if you research certain vehicles in a tech tree, it gives you bonuses to research in other tech trees. We'll see what they do with different mechanics to try and keep the game interesting, but it is an interesting thing to think about. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank Schnitzel Stroker, Brendan Quinn, Vilneus, Character Fuel, Carrion Crow, Nicholas Richardson, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, B. Young, Opium Prime, Masonocrat, Lafouche, Alan Hacker, Sem Arslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.